Thanks to Dr. Prerana, of course, for making the time and effort and to join us on an exchange, a very brief exchange program between Christ University in Bangalore and the AUC here in Cairo. Let me very quickly introduce Dr. Prerana, and then we can leave most of the time for the presentation and hopefully for the discussion that would ensue afterwards. So Dr. Prerana Srimaal is a faculty member at Christ University in Bangalore, India. She holds a doctorate from the Center for Historical Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Dr. Srimaal, it would be Srimaal, right? Like Sri Lanka? No. Okay, fine. Srimaal currently serves as the head of the liberal arts program at her university. With a strong background in research, she has actively participated in diverse projects and explorations throughout India and South Asia, fostering a comprehensive understanding of the past and its interpretation in the present, with a special focus on genocides, wars, human displacement and migration, with the help of material culture studies, urban historical and trauma narratives, as well as identity and memory politics. Her expertise lies in critically analyzing the ways in which historical contexts are reconstructed and comprehended within urban settings. Dr. Srimaal is leading an impactful project in collaboration with the National Mission on Monuments and Antiquities funded by the Government of India. This initiative aims to document and preserve 1,000 heritage sites in Bangalore, recognizing their cultural and historical significance. Her involvement in this project underscores her commitment to heritage conservation and her dedication to enhancing public awareness and application and appreciation of Bangalore's rich historical legacy. So Dr. Prerana is going to lecture on a topic that is definitely one that we have in comparative politics and political science more generally, but she comes from an extremely interesting background, that of archaeology. She migrated from archaeology to political science, but while still retaining much of her expertise in archaeology as well as in history. And that's why I really expect a very interesting lecture and discussion afterwards, especially given the timing with the Indian national elections, of course, that would last for another month, right? Yes, okay, it's a 6-week election, because you have 1 billion people, like speaking about logistical problems, 1 billion people participating. Okay, so without further ado, please, so it's up to you whether you would like to present using the podium or just present.
I think I'll just maybe walk around and.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. So just,
Hi everyone, I think, yeah, great, this works. So if I sit, I'm not really visible. If I stand behind this, I'm not very visible. So I thought it's better if I walk around. No, yeah, exactly. So as I always maintain, I think our intellect should be gigantic and not our sizes. So with that in mind, hi everyone. So I'm not going to talk about my work extensively because I think Dr. Amar gave a very, very elaborate profile of mine. Before I begin my presentation, I will say one thing. When we talk about anything coming from an Indian perspective, it is way too diverse and it's way too layered. So whatever I tell you today, please keep in mind, even though there'll be many things, I'll try and compress it, but please keep in mind that this is just a snapshot. So that's also to say that no matter how much I try to tell you how unique layered narratives there are, and how it's very difficult to really create a unilateral narrative of India, but at the same time, it's also to tell you that don't be completely within the frame that I tell you, because there is a structure even beyond what I tell you, because it's that diverse, right? So keeping that in mind, the very term identity, narratives, democracy, these are all extremely loaded terms. I'm not going to try and define any of these because I sort of assume that a basic understanding of these terms you would have already. But what I'll try to do is how each of them are created with a political past, in the political present, looking towards a political future. And I'm going to try and do that with an Indian perspective. And the reason I've chosen this particular, this particular framework for India, if you notice, India has also become sort of like a brand in itself, where certain aspects are globalized and certain aspects of its cultural traits are globalized. For instance, if you look at those basic images that I've given you, whether it is the first one with somebody sitting and doing some sort of yoga. I mean, Indian subcontinent is renowned for its yoga and yoga-based narratives, or whether it is the Great Indian Wedding, whether it is music, dance, those kind of traditions, whether it is elephants or our very beautiful, colorful elephants, because we love to paint on elephants as well, or whether it is, how can we not talk about another animal, which is the cow. So these are the symbols that have largely been looked at when we think of India. India, by its very nature, have been subsumed within these symbols, and it has become like the cultural theme. But what I'm going to try and attempt to show you things which we don't always see, which probably is the larger framework of India, but we don't always talk about that. And this is going to be a flow of how I'm going to take you through it. I'm going to talk about historical perspectives, because even though I talk about political narratives, like Amar mentioned, I talk about war, I talk about mass atrocities, those are my current areas of focus, but I look at them from a historical and a material culture perspective. So my idea is that there are people who can't speak. One of the reasons they can't speak is because we've created a political narrative, or we've created a space where only certain voices are heard, or only certain languages are heard. There's a bulk of those other kind of spaces where we don't hear them. So my idea was that maybe we can look at them and talk about them through the things that they have created and things that they have left behind. Because I don't think that this is the only way of communication. There are multiple ways of communication, and maybe it's high time all those communication forms are also brought into political narratives, rather than having only one way of looking at it. So on that note, I'm going to talk about historical frameworks first. In my experience, I actually had a science background. I was doing physics, and then I moved towards history background. With history, I also looked into archaeological background, and from a very long time, in all my studies and my years of teaching, one thing I have known to be a fact, which is people love to hate history. They feel that it's not important. They feel that it's done and dusted with, it's dead. And we completely combine history with dates, with names, with facts, with regional narratives, and so on and so forth. This makes it very easy to abuse history. Because the majority of people don't care for history, or they have been taught to hate history, people don't really ask where that idea has come from. Like one of the biggest problems that I have seen in the creation of political narratives is, in most places, there are going to be claims by any group of people. Whether it is a popular group within the society, whether it is a political group, whether it's a cultural group, there will always be very strong claims. But we will never know what the basis of those claims are. They're almost shrouded in anonymity. We don't know where it comes from. And nobody questions it. Like, you read something in a history textbook, I'm sure we all go through school level education, there is this state-sponsored curriculum that we all have to follow. Lots of things are written there. But how many times have we seen people ask, why is it written this way? Why is this ruler important, and what happened then in between 3 years? Sometimes people will simply tell you that at this point, this one important, then you move on and they go to the next ruler, and in between there are 10 dark years which you have no idea about. By dark, I mean there's no information. But nobody asks why. And nobody asks even this, why is it that this one seems to be more important than that? So that's what I mean. It makes it very, very easy to create new historical narratives, because nobody is going to ask you where it is coming from. And in most cases, in the Indian perspective, we have very unclear sources. Like, somebody will tell you there is a huge 5,000-year-old Hindu past. Hinduism has become very central to the Indian identity. And people will tell you this. And very, very strongly and very confidently they will tell you that there is a 5,000-year-old Hindu past. You ask them for sources, it's written in scriptures. In actuality, Indian subcontinent does not have scriptures. Which scriptures are people talking about? We don't know. But if you ask them, this movement also becomes politicized by saying, you are a traitor for asking these. But then you never know what you are a traitor to. So all of these are questions which has no answers at all. So with that, in most cases, all that I'm going to show you, history has become also very linear. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. there is a recording happening. Now, if someone were to ask what happened today, the only thing that people will get to know is what is going to be shown as a recording. That becomes the only linear history of today. But in reality, there are about 15 different histories taking place right now. There's a horizontal space to history too, which is never taken into account when these linear directives are created. You each have a way. You each probably have a perspective as to how the lecture went today. Or maybe you each learned something different today. Or you each had a different story to tell about the lecture today. But what will be recorded? Will any of this be recorded? No. You may write in your social media accounts, or you may write as a class assignment, but that will still remain up to you and within your space. It will never become a public space. It will never be part of the public domain. The only thing that will remain is that one recording. But then does that mean that's a fact, that's the reality? No, this is a negotiated reality, right? And that negotiation we need to be very clear about, that even though we hear something, it does not mean that's the only way. But in a lot of linear histories, only certain things are taken to be true, and people believe all the rest of it is just nothing. There's nothing that happening. So for instance, if there's a civilization, I mean, we claim to have a 25-year-old civilized, 25,000 BC, a civilization happened in the Indian subcontinent. I'll tell you about that in a brief span. But if that is happening in the northwest part of the country, everybody believes nothing else was happening in the rest of the country, as if all the people were concentrated there. That's the only hangout spot. The rest of the country, it was just blank. Nobody was there. Can that be rationally true? Can't be rationally true. And it's such an easy, simple thing to say. But when you're sitting in a classroom, that remains the only rational thought. That, okay, only this was there and nothing else was there. That's what happens with linear histories. And one of the things that I do want to maybe focus on, colonization, I think you all understand it a little bit, so I'm not gonna put a lot of time on that, but I'm gonna try and put you more in touch with the cornerstones of Indian political movement. And I'm using the word political with a lot of, I'm trying to be very cautious here in terms of using the word political, but I'll try to explain why. So the 4 cornerstones that we see in the current political flavor, maybe some of the things you might identify with as well, is izzat, which clearly just means honor, and honor can be differently layered. Nobody really explains whose honor, why this honor, how do you protect this honor, but every society creates its own rules about honor. Unity, this idea that we are creating a homogeneous identity because that's the only way forward. But at the end of it is that because of this homogeneous identity, which you think is the idea of unity in the nation, you get rid of the heterogeneous identities that the people have and the multivariate cultures that they have of their own. Then we also have this idea of biradari, which is community. And a lot of things is justified in the name of community. In some cases, large-scale violence is also justified in the name of community, who's trying to protect somebody's honor. That's how the narratives take place. And finally is bhaichara, and very literally it actually just means brotherhood. And I'm using the word brotherhood with a lot of focus here. I clearly actually mean brotherhood. We are talking about a more gender-specific society as well, in terms of who are the protectors and what are this bond going to be about. And these kind of narratives, these kind of ideas have sort of become the cornerstone of not only the community, but by default even the political movements that we see presently in the country. On that note, I want to take you through some of the layers of the past. Now, these images are largely from about 1920s to 1950s. So in 1920s, the Archaeological Survey of India was still under the British administration, but by 1950s, the handover had already taken place. So even though the Director General, even in 1950s, was a British official, but largely it was still under the Indian government by then, because by 1950, Constitution of India had taken into effect, and it was the Republic of India by this time. So the images that you see here, this is from what is one of the oldest river valley civilizations that we have in the South Asian continent. It's the Indus Valley civilization. One of the mature periods are seen to be around 2500 BCE. So it's supposed to be that old, and there are certain other dates that push it a little further back in time as well. But then the later part is largely to be around 2000 to 1800 BCE. So you have, it's an extensive civilization, and in the present perspective, it captures large parts of Pakistan. The site that you see actually on the screen right now is in Pakistan. These are from Mohenjo-daro, one of the most famous sites that we have from this place. Now, what are the reasons? But the fact of the matter is that even though some of the most popular sites of this civilization, which is Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, have moved to Pakistan since the independence happened of India and Pakistan post-partition, but there is a large part of it also in India. So it's a collective identity. And so much so that if you notice, it's an extremely extensive civilization. It has layers and layers, like the same structures being reused, repurposed. We have so many narratives of that sort. Like if you look at the bottom image here, that size will give you an idea how small the human being is in comparison to the walls. And these are walls of the granary of that time. So they had this extensively large granaries. We have records, and we have archaeological record of all the things that I'm talking about. But the reason I'm showing you this picture is that there is no way of defining this as Hindu. It's an extensive civilization of its own culture. We know quite a bit about it, but we haven't been able to decipher its language. We do believe that it did have a language of its own. There were written scripts, but there was no way of, we did not have a Rosetta Stone for this particular script, so there was no way of deciphering that language. So it still seemed to be a proto-historic period, which means that we know that the people were writing and talking and literate, but we have no way of knowing what they were saying. But there is absolutely no way of calling this Hindu. But if you look into, if you ever go to India and you look at these large-scale demonstrations that take place or the large-scale narratives that takes place, somehow this gets subsumed within the larger Hindu narrative. And the reason of that being, and that image I'm not showing you here, but I'm telling you, there was a seal found in these excavations. It's a very famous seal. It's called the Pashupati seal. It had this person in a yogic position sitting, and it was wearing a headdress which seemed to have these horns. And people assumed that that looked very similar to another Hindu god named Shiva. So they believed that, okay, this means that this is an uninterrupted Hindu narrative. But in reality, it was nothing of that sort. We don't even know what that seal means. But that's how you create. Now, I'm going to show you further layers. I'm going back and forth in time. This is from around 300 BCE. This is images of Buddha, all right, from two different parts of the country. The one that you find here is more from the eastern part of the country, where you would see present-day states of Uttar Pradesh or Bihar. This was found in Uttar Pradesh. And the other one, the emancipated Buddha, which is just after his enlightenment happened. So that one is more from the northwest part of the country. All right, and we find very similar ones like this in Pakistan too, and in Afghanistan as well. So there's a cultural continuity that we also know about, but at the same time, one of the reasons I'm trying to show you this is that Indian subcontinent had many different philosophies playing around in that time zone. Not only was it the birthplace of this idea of Buddhism, it was also the birthplace of an idea called Jainism, but none of these were looked at as religions. These were more philosophies. These were ways of life. This was people telling you how you should lead your life so that your life is more fulfilling and it has a purpose. But at the same time, it also has a political underpinning. Because based on these thoughts, most of these thinkers, whether it is Buddha or Mahavira, they also had their own points of view, not just in the freedom of your soul or the enlightenment of your soul, but at the same time, how states should be run. They didn't directly say it, but they did have a very political underpinning to their philosophies and thought processes as well. But they never called it a religion. None of these things was anything close to religion. But later day narratives converts all of this into religion. Now, this is around the same time. Like if you see on the top there, those are some of the first rock-cut temples that we have in the country. They are somewhere around 300 BCE as well, what we call the Mauryan age in the Indian subcontinent. So an entire rock surface, they simply cut into it to create that. And if you see in the bottom here, these are the relief, that work that you have, very intricate detailing that you have in all of these spaces. But more interestingly, around the same time, if you notice these, Now, the top panel actually talks about the birth of Buddha, and with all great human beings, somehow their births are always very mystical, and they are mostly all the time similar to a virgin birth. So if you notice here, the middle figure is supposed to be the mother of Buddha, and the birth of Buddha, if you see, there's a baby sticking out from under her arms. So that's supposed to be how he was born, because the idea is that, they are not usual, regular human beings. They are very different. They are above human beings. In most cases, their stories of birth are also appealing in that respect. But the reason I'm showing you these two are actually Buddhist god and goddesses. This is Panchika and Hariti. I'm not going to tell you the story, but the reason I'm showing you all of this is that all of this was found in the Indian subcontinent, and it was made by artisans there. This is not because some traveler came and brought them there. These were made, and extensive records of such kind of artifacts have been found. But if you look very closely, they have an extreme Hellenistic flavor. Yes. Nobody would look at it. Like, for instance, this one in the corner, it's very similar to a narrative that you will see of Apollo and Daphne. So nobody, if they saw it without context, they would have assumed that this is from the Hellenistic world. Nobody would have thought that it was actually found in eastern part of India and northwestern part of India. Even a place like Mathura, for instance, you find this. And so you also find in northwest. Yes, you do find it there, but you also find it in East India. So it's extensive. And you find it for a long, long time. And you also find half-made ones, which means that artisans were making it right there. It's not as if it's only because somebody brought it with them through some travel narratives. So, which adds another flavor to our entire discussion, which again brings the question, how do we create this identity when it is so multivariate? And these people came and lived and settled in that part of the country and in that time zone. Like, for instance, I'll tell you one thing. I've been here in Cairo for about 10 days now. Quite a few times I have gone to the main city, walked around. People talk to me in Egyptian Arabic. They constantly tell me, and when I don't respond, they get a little offended in the beginning that I'm choosing to not speak because I must be one of those foreign-bred English-speaking ones. I have to actually explain. And they are surprised because why is it I look the way I do if I'm from India? Because they have an idea about how Indians should look, right? But the question is, in India, I'm pretty regular. Nobody looks at me twice. That, okay, no, she looks like a foreigner. No. But then there are people in India where people will look back at them at twice and say that they are looking so foreign, they can't be from here. So it's kind of like a mix of things, and one has to understand who really is the outsider here, who's the other? Because we are all, I mean, if I'm to tell you, I just showed you a historical time frame here, there's so many people who come and settle down in the Indian subcontinent so far long ago. How do we now differentiate who are the rightful people and who are the wrongful people, right? So that's one of the reasons I'm showing you this. Now, there is a very popular narrative of India, which is Kama Sutra, which is also this, I mean, it's extremely popular about the idea that how Indian esoteric movements also talked about love-making and so on and so forth. But what they not talk about is that it was not that there was a certain group of people doing it. We have extensive temple systems in central part of India, in western part of India, in eastern part of India, large temples dedicated to maybe the sun god in one place, dedicated to Brahma, which is one of the holy trinity that we have. These temples have extensive panels like this. They are huge temples, large-scale temples, which have panels which are all, if you look closely, that's why I gave you some close-ups of the panels too. And these are right at the outside. These are not that you have to enter the temple and only then you will get to see, which would have meant a more private perspective, like a more private view that you can have. But imagine there is a town. And in the town, the temples are the largest things that you can come across. They dominate the landscape. They're huge in size. And there, you have these kind of work right outside, which means everybody can see it. Doesn't matter how old, young, who you are, what you are. That also means, and one of the things that we know for a fact, that these temple spaces, because they also cover large areas, were community spaces, which means entire families are coming there, which again talks about that these are not maybe very esoteric, few people talking about it and writing about it. No, it was very much part of philosophies and the idea. And again, this is from 10th century BC, sorry, not 10th century CE, all right? So it's much more recent in comparison to the earlier ones that I was showing you. And this is not the only place. You don't just find it in central India, you also find it in western India, like the state of Gujarat. You will find temples like this, which is very interesting because state of Gujarat currently is also the place which has become very fundamentalist, Hindu dominated as well. Then you will also find it in East India. There are temples dedicated to that, which you will have panels like this. So that's another. So this temple is a Vishnu temple. Tantric are mostly Shiva temples, which makes it even more interesting because people believe that Shiva had a more sexual dynamic energy and so it was associated with him. And Shiva is a more like a family god, like Ram is seen to be an avatar of Shiva. So a Vishnu temple having this is quite interesting, which means that it's not such a niche movement after all. So again, these are some other perspectives of India that I wanted to show you. If you look at the top corner there, that is the Qutub Minar complex. That's in the middle is the Qutub Minar. So Indian subcontinent, especially northern part of the country, we also had a Mamluk dynasty, which was one of the first Islamic dynasties that we had in the subcontinent. Somewhere in the 12th century is when the dates are seen to be, 12th, 13th century. And that construction was started by the first ruler that we had from the Mamluk dynasty, who was Iltutmish. But subsequently, from the Mamluks, we had other kind of Turkic dynasties and Persian rulers also taking up, till we had the Mughals coming in, which was much later in the 16th century. But they identified New Delhi, which is the current capital, as their capital. Before that, in most cases, the capital used to be Lahore, which is in current day Pakistan, but the Mamluks shifted it to Delhi. So the idea of looking at Delhi as the capital actually came from the Islamic dynasties that we had, shifting the capital from Lahore to New Delhi. And that was the first kind of, and even now if you ever visit New Delhi in India, there are extensive, so different parts of the city correspond to different dynasties. Like for instance, we had Khaljis, we had Tughlaqs, we had Lodhis, and so on and so forth, and each part of the city has been created by them, and their architecture is also appealing in terms of the kind of things they patronized. And all of that is extensive part of the current day narrative. And at the same time, if you look at the bottom, everybody talks about Taj Mahal. I'm sure you can see the white marble thing in the background. What they don't talk about is the Agra Fort, which is the rampart that you see right in the, that was a Mughal architecture. So on top, that is from 12th century. From the bottom, that's from 17th century. So there's a huge gap. But at the same time, extensive fortifications, complete cities, complete towns being recreated, which are still very much part of the Indian space. These cities are still very much important. So again, these are perspectives that we never really get to see. The one that you see at the top, that's actually Ajanta. That's a very old one again. It's again from about 100 BCE. It's a completely rock-cut temple. That entire thing was an actual cave which they carved in and created this particular temple to show that, you know, the narratives of this kind of architecture is pretty old and pretty diverse, right? But now I'm going to take you to the political path. This is what India is seen to be now. What I just showed you was what the subcontinent has to show. And I showed you maybe just 4 or 5% of it. I didn't really show you a lot. But this is what it has become. What are these? I mean, this present day narrative of this very, very colorful people. They also like to dress up their animals in the same colors that they wear. And these temples dominating the landscape everywhere. Wherever you go, there'll be a temple and an entire narrative around the temple. And of course, lots of singing, dancing. I mean, people practically think that everywhere people are singing, dancing, wearing extremely colorful clothes. I'm not going to say that it's it doesn't have any iota of truth. Of course it does. There are groups of people who are wearing very colorful outfits. There are groups of people who do worship different kinds of animals. But to say that this is what modern India is grossly inaccurate. Because no, it is not. I mean, seriously, it's not. I don't own anything that colorful, not at all. Most of my friends do not as well. And I'm, again, like I said, I'm a very regular Indian. Nobody will look at me twice. I'm that regular. So the question here is, it's not the reality of many as well. It's not the mainstream reality. It's not the majority reality. Then how did it become? That's the question we need to really ask. How did it become this? From all that I showed you, how did only this remain? And why do we not see anything like from 12th century to about 18th century, we have constant Islamic dynasties in the Indian subcontinent. How come we don't see any of that? Why has it become so? This is where I'm going to take you a little briefly into the creation of modern India. There are very few snapshots that I'm going to show you, some of the very major events that shaped the Indian identity today. First thing that you see right here, this is an image from the partition. So in 1947, when the Dominion, it was called the Dominion of India at that time, was being created because of a Government of India Act of 1935, which meant that we are going to get our independence. The entire territory was divided into two nations, one of them being Pakistan, present-day Pakistan, and the other being India, which meant, so Pakistan, the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent and the eastern part of the Indian subcontinent, these two places were being divided into, and the new state of Pakistan was being created. So it's a very strange geographical entity. Right in the middle, you have the Indian space. On her west is West Pakistan, on her east is East Pakistan, not connected, but they form the same nation. The reason being that these two states were going to be Muslim states, and they were very clear about that, but this decision was told to the common public right at the last minute. Till for a long time, the political narrative was that the two-nation theory will not be accepted and so on and so forth. But towards the end, it seemed like that is the only viable option left to the politicians at that time and the freedom struggle leaders at that time. And people, so imagine you are living in what will become West Pakistan, and you are maybe a Sikh or a Hindu or a Buddhist or any of these. But you live there. That's where you have always lived, because you see the Indian subcontinent was never divided on the basis of religion. It never was. It was cultural. There were different kinds of languages, there were different kinds of traditions, there were different kinds of narratives around it, but never about religion. But suddenly you get to hear that wherever you are living, it's going to become a Muslim nation tomorrow, and you only have like a few days to pack up your bags, either choose to live here, where you don't know if you will be protected, because fear is a very strong thing. Sometimes we make very irrational decisions because of fear, and fear is also something that spreads very quickly. It's extremely contagious. So if I am coming here and I get to hear that, okay, where I stay, it's going to become Pakistan tomorrow, and I'm not a Muslim, so I might be threatened, I'm going to tell that to my neighbor, and my neighbor will feel similarly. My third neighbor may not feel this way, but when they see that everybody's leaving, they feel even more isolated. So they leave as well. So what resulted was a huge, unprecedented mass migration. It's estimated that almost 20 million were displaced at that time in the eastern part and the western part. And they moved across borders. As you can imagine, these kind of trains, completely full of people, majority of these trains were also burned by the regular people. So it also led to a lot of violence, large-scale rioting. People started hearing tales like in the neighboring village, a Muslim girl has been abused. So they all went to kill. And because that killing happened, that killing spree would spread. And sometimes you would hear news that have never happened, but somebody just heard something from someone, so by way of, just narratives like that, it spread. So again, according to very traditional records, it's estimated that at least 1.5 million died in that few months of partition. So you can imagine what a huge narrative this is. I mean, at the same time that you get your independence, is also the same time that there is a huge scar that has been left in the subcontinent. Even now, places like Lahore, places like Delhi, places like Calcutta, these are the few places where most of these migratory populations also moved and settled in, because these were large cities even at that time. There are refugee colonies, because there were new places right at the outskirts of the city that didn't exist before partition, but started existing because these refugee settlements got converted into colonies and residential locations. And there are still some living memories, that there are still a lot of oral history projects were conducted. There are still some living memories of people who can never forget. So the nation was created with a new other, an already created entity that you are hating, and that becomes part of your identity. Even though just the day before, they were your cousins, they were your neighbors, they were your extended family. You lived in the same village, but the day after, they become your sworn enemies. And this has been constantly drummed up to this day. Even now, these scars have not really been completely gotten rid of. Now, with this, at the same time, we had the new sovereign government coming into space. So in 47, we have the Dominion of India, but we don't have a constitution yet. And we, like the leaders of that time, they were not ready to accept whatever the constitutional space or narratives were given by the colonial government at that time. And they were very clear that they wanted to create their own. So a constituent assembly was formed in 1946. It had over 388 or 389 members. They were indirectly elected. So it wasn't elected, but it was an indirect election. And all of these representatives sat together for almost 3 years to draft the Indian Constitution. And you see one of the proceedings here. These are the proceedings of the Constituent Assembly, where a drafting committee was there, and they were creating this new constitution. The constitution was finally complete in November of 1949, and it was ratified and passed, and the Dominion of India became Republic of India on 26th January 1950, when it was formally accepted and ratified. Now that led to the first large-scale elections that we had. So since its birth, it's been one of the most largest democracies in the world. It's got a huge population. Currently it's upwards of 1.5 billion, 1.6 or 7, I don't know. I forgot the last count. I'm telling you the count from 2022. Huge population. The first elections took place in 1950. It had a 60% turnout, which is a large turnout for the first time elections. And even at that time, there was a large urban population that participated, but more importantly, rural participants were there. Like for instance, you see that man who's being carried, he was known to be about 101 at that time. And he was seen as one of the oldest voters for that particular election. So this is a new space, a new India, new creation, even though there are horrors, but people feel that through these elections, they can create a new identity of their own. They take it very seriously. They take it very, very seriously. But at the same time, what they created was another new pantheon. So that is Nehru. He was the first prime minister, and he continued to be in office. So from 47 to, he won the elections in 1950. He won it several times again. And he continued to be the prime minister till 64 when he passed away. And he supposedly passed away of a heart problem, and that also because he felt very betrayed by China, which is another enemy that we have in the Indian subcontinent, if it's not Pakistan, when we talk about China. So he, and in the other picture that you see, so Nehru is the first prime minister that we have. That's his daughter, Indira Gandhi. Yes, and that's the grandson, Rajiv Gandhi. You're looking at all three prime ministers. So you get rid of the British crown, but you create a new dynasty of your own. And that's another very strange aspect that we need to talk about when we talk about democratic choice. So what does it really mean? We have to ask that. I mean, just giving the right to vote, does that really translate too much? Or does it have to be more narratives attached to it? It's also how you propagate, how you create a space, and what kind of narratives you create. So one of the things that Nehru was, his critics have always said that even though Nehru created the foundation of a modern India, He put a lot of focus in technology, in industrialization, in scientific temper, making things in the country and so on and so forth, which is all very good. It was very good for the working classes, for small-term businessmen, for some sort of industrial families as well. But what he did not cater to was the urban poor and the rural poor. And he did not cater to the fundamentalists. Now, the thing about democracy is that the society will be made of all kinds of people. You can't throw them out. There will be fundamentalists in society. How do you handle that? How do you take care of that? That is something that the government never really took care of, which led to, I'm going to talk about that at the end, which led to this. This is what the Indian government looks like now. That's the face of current Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He's been in power since 2014. His party is a right-wing party, but his party is also affiliated to extreme right-wing fundamentalists as well, who constantly talk about a Hindu national nation. And what you see here is their current election propaganda, which, if you notice at the background, are temples, which are all new temples, which the government created. What you see at the bottom is the kind of diaspora that supports him as well. These are rich, this is from New York, from the Times Square. So the new temple that was inaugurated in India, it was broadcast everywhere. And he claims that he listens to people, he's bringing wealth, and he's doing things for the Indian who's a Hindu. And how am I confident of that? If you notice, that's Narendra Modi, and he's inaugurating a temple dedicated to Ram. Now, I showed you the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly created a constitution that called India a secular, a socialist, sovereign, secular republic, which means that the elected leader of the people, the Prime Minister, shouldn't be inaugurating temples. Even if he wants to, he may want to, but he cannot. But that's what the reality now is. And that temple was created by the demolition of this mosque that you see. This was called Babri Masjid. It was demolished by a mob. Those people that you see, they demolished it with their bare hands in December 1992. And in place of that, a new temple was created, which is the temple that you see right at the top, which is the Ram temple, the Ayodhya temple. And that was all done under this particular government. And the other thing that I wanted to also show you is, if you see it here at the bottom here, and in the middle there, the inauguration of the temple was turned into a social media event. It was almost like a red carpet event. People came, they posed everywhere, they were talking about it, they took selfies, and they posted it on their social media accounts, and it was like the best thing to do. If you're anybody who's known in the circuit, you will be at the temple inauguration. Overnight, it became that. So that also created a very new kind of narrative of the country. But I'm going to end it with the other India. All of this is fine, you know, all this temple creation and all of that. But how are the rest of the, like, in this space where Constitution took like 2.5, almost 3 years to make, and it was so important for people, what is it doing for the people? Now, even today, we have things like GAPP panchayats in India. These are absolutely illegal bodies in local villages, these elders coming together, almost like a kangaroo court, where they are, and you remember the 4 cornerstones that I was talking about? The honor, the brotherhood, and all those kind of narratives. And they come together and they decide what is honorable, and they pass judgments. They have no right to do that, but they pass judgments, and people still take care of those judgments. These are some of the glimpses. For instance, people can't live there. And this is a very big reality. And this is not some small group that this is adhering to. It's like big, big groups of people who are affected by it, can't make their choices as to who they will marry. They can't make their choices as to how they will live, what they will eat. There was one particular case, which if you're ever interested, you can search it up. There was a member of parliament from the BJP party who said things like, you know, the young kids these days, they don't understand honor and things like that. And one of the reasons is that they eat a lot of Chinese food. And that Chinese food does something to their brain, and they don't listen to parents, and they don't honor things. And he was applauded for this kind of thought, Then there's another MP who said things like, because lots of people, especially the women, are wearing torn jeans. So because the jeans are torn, and that's the kind of choices they're making, so obviously they are tearing down the honor of the society as well. And these are all said in public spaces. And these are people who hold votes, right? So what does that mean? If this is what the political, I mean, it's just full of it, like there's so many. There are people are also killed by these are honor killings. So you married somebody outside your caste. I'm not gonna get into caste, but it's another big specter in Indian society. You didn't marry according to the ones that you were supposed to marry, which means that your own family, through those khap panchayats, those kangaroo courts, will rule against you. And in some cases, maybe you'll be forced to break down that marriage and marry someone else, but in many cases, you'll actually be killed to set an example for society. And these honor killings are quite rampant. Maybe not in the entirety of the country, but certain pockets of the country, it's quite rampant. So it's, if I say that complete gender equality is there, not really true, right? And that brings us final thing that it's not an equal society. There are lots of people, but a lot of voices are not heard. We don't have spaces where these are even visible because the identity of the country is becoming very homogeneous, very one track, and we don't know who that represents. And at the end of the day, I mean, if we have to still talk about democratic narratives, there's a lot of conversations that need to happen. There are a lot of discussions that need to happen. But I think the first thing is recognition that the political spaces in your country are also becoming extremely polarized. And things that shouldn't have been part of the narrative are becoming part of the narrative, which is going against the historical flavor of the subcontinent as well. On that note, I'll end it here. Maybe we can have some questions if we still have time. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
About like how this intersects with the political project of Hindutva. Like, does it always intersect? Because like caste, of course, is something that we don't know anything about, and if we know, we don't understand. But so it seems that the yellow places, for instance, are the non-Hindu parts of India, right?
Absolutely.
This is where we have the Naga, like
they cannot claim those are Hindus.
yes,
Yeah.
these are where we have like the
Yes.
mainly Christians, right? Like the tribal.
Yeah. So one is Kashmir, the top one, Jammu and Kashmir.
And the other one is
The northeastern part, yes.
Nagaland.
Yes. So it's actually interesting to talk about it, but I'm going to try and keep it very brief. So there are two ways to understand why this differential treatment has really happened in the Indian subcontinent. Now, the idea of Hindu is a very political identity. It is really nothing to do with one singular religion. Like in India, we did not have one type of religion. Like I was telling you, it was a lot of different philosophical thoughts coming in together. But when the British colonization happened, they didn't understand this. They didn't understand what it meant. There is no holy book, there is no one group. There are so many groups, so many languages. Who are they? They all seem to pray to different gods and goddesses and so on and so forth. Now, with this, we need to talk about caste. Caste created a very hierarchical society completely. And caste is a very difficult thing to understand. Like, it's not just a professional classing of society. It's not just your economic class. It's much, much more beyond that, all right? And there were people who were segregated. So there is only one group of people right at the top who were called the Brahmins, who were the only ones who were allowed to do any kind of intellectual discussions or read or study and so on and so forth. They were like hardly 1 or 2% of society. Then there were the second group of people who were the ruling class. So again, the aristocracy would belong to it and the ruling dynasties would belong to it. So they were responsible for taking care of the state and so on and so forth. But they were allowed to study a little bit. But all the studies that they could do had to do with state structure and military-based studies and so on and so forth, strategies and all of that. But not the kind of intellectual discussions or philosophy that the Brahmins could do. And if they did, then they were seen to be weak rulers because they're wasting time and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then you have a largely bigger class of people who are the traders, the businessmen, the wealthy merchants, and so on and so forth, but they're much lower in society. A slightly larger group in society, maybe about 15% of people. Then you have a very large group of people just below it, which are the peasants, the working class, the poor peasants, the service industry, and so on and so forth people. But again, even though they are numerous in comparison to the other three that I'm talking about, but they would still maybe make about 20-25% of society. Which means you would wonder, where are the rest? I mean, if only so few people are in all these groups, where are the rest of the country, the bulk of the country? These are the people who are outside of this four group of caste dynamics. These are the untouchables. These are this large group of people who are taking care of every working in society, cleaning up, handling the basic manual scavenging, or doing the labor, the heavy duty labor, all kinds of unskilled labor that you have. And these were largely called the Dalits. Now, you would wonder, and the problem with this caste dynamic is that you can't move from one caste to another. You really can't. And within the caste dynamic, you also have subcastes and clans, which means that when I'm talking about the honor killings, if you marry within a clan to another clan also, you could be going against your family, and you could be punished for that. Now, what happens, how was all of this politicized, is that, again, coming back to the British colonization, when they came, they couldn't figure out what's happening in this society. So the top 1-2% of society, along with the ruling class, so the top intellectual class and the ruling class, they found this opportunity with the British colonizers to create a narrative that, you see, there is a religion in India, and that is Hinduism, even though there wasn't. And within that Hinduism, they subsumed all kinds of people who were either not Muslim or not Christian. So every other group who were not Muslims or not Christians was subsumed within the identity of a Hindu, which meant that there are other religions, if you want to call them religion. There are Buddhists, there are Jains, there are Sikhs. There's so many different kinds of people. But all of them were subsumed within the political narrative of being a Hindu. Which means, if you look at this map, the places where, the place which is safer, which is yellow, the two parts of the country that looks to be safer, we don't have any Hindus there, because in most cases, those are dominated by either Christians or Muslims. So you can't call them Hindus. And rest everywhere, and I told you, the Dalits were the largest group of people outside the caste framework. They were the untouchables. Everywhere else, they are in chaos. Which means that this dominating narrative that the Indian government have today, they created out of completely politicizing a religious identity by bringing everybody under that and creating a popular narrative where everybody believed that, okay, I mean, I cannot say it because I'm a Hindu. Like, according to the government records, I'm supposed to be a Hindu. But if you tell that to my family, they get upset. No, you're not Hindus. We're not at all Hindus. But then according to the government records, I am one. So if I cast a vote, or if I say something against the government narratives, as a Hindu, I'm saying something against the government. Even though, I mean, it doesn't even matter whether I think I'm a Hindu or not. And then you become like a traitor to your own kind, which, of course, somebody like me doesn't feel like that or think like that, so I'm still going to say what I have to say, but that's not going to be true for majority of the country, because people will not always think like this. And that became simpler for the government to create that dominant narrative. Yeah.
So I have a question. You mentioned when the Constitution was being formed that there were indirect elections, and I wondered what you meant by that.
Okay.
And also how the formation.
were elected, oh, thanks. Provincial assemblies were elected spaces, and direct elections used to take place, like people would vote for their particular people and they would come into power and so on and so forth. So when this constituent assembly idea was formed, the representatives of the people in the provincial assemblies, they elected the ones who would go into constituent assembly. So that's why it was indirect. So it's not people choosing the members of the constituent assembly, it's their representatives who were choosing these members. That's one. Now, the Indian government, when it was first formed and the constitution was being made and the drafting committee came together, one of the things that they were very clear about is that this is not a Hindu nation. This is a secular nation. And they went into a lot of effort to try and say that this is a secular space. In fact, it was very difficult to do so because at that time, there were almost like 560 odd princely states, which means that entire subcontinent that you see, it was not one homogeneous identity. There were lots of kings and queens there too, who had their own spaces of power. But all of this was brought together to create the Union of India. And one of the things that was very clearly mentioned was that caste is abolished. Any kinds of titles, hereditary titles, are abolished. You cannot hold any titles. You cannot get anything on the basis, claiming that because you're a Brahmin, you can do this and so on and so forth. All of this was established. One of the focus at that time was moving towards a more, like one of the things that Nehru very famously would have said, it did not really have, like the Congress party at that time, did not really have a political ideology in place. Nobody could figure out if it is a far right, right, left, what kind of. So Nehru very famously at that time is supposed to have said that the only ideology we care for is the development of the country, nothing else. And his policies were very directed towards, like government policies till about 60s, were very directed towards development in terms of education, in terms of big industries, heavy industries, and science and technology, and so on and so forth. But there are always fundamentalists in society, and there were always people who are really poor. So there weren't really much space for them to really uplift themselves. Like you're talking about a large population of people who never had anything. How do you make sure they all get it? This is not something that the government really was very good at. And at the same time, in 47, in 62, in 65, in 67, 71, there were constant wars. Wars with China, wars with Pakistan. So for a new nation to be in so many wars means that there was a lot of military expenditure as well. And in all of these spaces, the government really never took care of this disgruntled in the society. And those disgruntled created a block of their own and created a dominant narrative today. So it's not as if the government at that time worked towards it. No, this is a very recent movement. It's more like 2014 onwards. I cannot say that I can exactly answer your question, but will tell you one thing about the way it's been working in Indian democracy. So people would largely believe that this particular government coming into power is something that the will of the people demands. This is what the people chose, this is what they wanted, and that's why they are in power. But you see, I think elections are way more complicated than that. It's not so simple. In a lot of spaces, it's not as if it's a government that came into power because the entire majority wanted them. No, it's also because the options that you have otherwise, like for instance, the the extreme popularity that Congress used to have earlier is decreasing over a period of time because there are many people who are not happy with the way things are running. At the same time, the fundamentalist government that is now coming into power, which came into power like a decade ago, their kind of people, the numbers are definitely increasing, but they're not increasing to an extent that they are really the only dominant party. No. In spaces of democracy, it's also what you get to see and how much you're able to see it. It's not always completely free. Like, for instance, it's not as if in India the media is controlled by the government directly. It's not. It's supposed to be free, private media is also there. But then what happens that there are big industrialists who are supporting the particular party. So they're donating money there and they're also buying up these media houses, which means that what you get to see in the media, even though it's supposed to be free media, is going to be tainted stories, supporting a particular kind of narrative, and you will not get to see any other kind. If you've ever seen Fox News, if you've ever seen the kind of constant battles, verbal battles and screaming matches that happens, this has become a big part of Indian media now. People are called and there's constant screaming matches. You'll never get to see what you want to say. There's going to be this person who's constantly angrily screaming you down. So what it means is that even though people feel there is a free space for negotiation, it really isn't. It's how much visibility you have, how much choice you have, and how you exercise it. You know, bulk of modern India in the urban spaces, they hardly vote anymore. So people like us, who are educated, who know what the problems are, they will make these assumptions that, okay, I'm not going to vote, I don't want this party, I don't know if there is an alternative party I want to, I'm going to make a statement and I'm not going to vote. That doesn't mean that they're winning any moral battle, they are not really, because there are others who are still voting. So the ones who are voting out of maybe something that they're gaining out of the government or some promises that they feel that the government will keep, or they simply don't care. Like, democracy also works with awareness, but the awareness reaches to what extent? And it's not just to do with education. It's not something that you only discuss in classrooms. It's also how you are grown, how you are brought up, what kind of discussions take place at your home. So it's way more complicated and it's not very clearly defined in the Indian space as well. So, for instance, let's say there is a group sitting here who are completely for the government. There is a group there who does not identify with the government and is against it. 3-4 people sitting there, 4-5 people sitting there, but there is 10 people sitting here, 4-5 people sitting there. Now the question is, if you count them together, there are 15 in number who are against the government to 10 who are sitting together. But they don't know of each other's existence. When they see this 10, they think the 10 is a majority. They think of themselves as 4 or 5. So they don't see that they feel that I'm lesser in number and they will overpower me. And because they don't speak up, they don't know about the existence of other groups that could have come together. Maybe they don't even have a common platform to talk. So that also becomes a problem. It's not as if the entirety of the country wants this to happen. There are many who do not. But they don't know how to have that conversations. And we don't have a very viable opposition, which is also becoming a big problem. A lot of people are like, okay, at least this government is doing something, let's vote for it. Where is the opposition? If not him, then who? And that's something that is very smart. So the government has created a space where nobody else sees anybody else, which also means it's not very democratic. Yeah, I mean, honestly, if you don't have opposition, if you don't have choices, it can't really be democratic. You need to have those. You need to have others visible. Even if you don't agree with them, it doesn't matter, you have to agree with the other, but there has to be another and a space for the other to speak.
So there's very clearly a global pattern of a rise in
Yeah.
right-wing government
I think that requires another talk. It's not a very simple answer. There's no way I can say anything in 1 or 2 sentences that will cover this. But I will say one thing. I do know that whatever I talked about India can be India specific, but at the same time, it is a globalized world, and a lot of parties that come into power or the kind of governments that stay in power also manage to do so because of their networks, of the foreign policies that they have and the kind of networks that they have. So it's quite disturbing that it almost feels that we have gone 100 years back in time, where everybody's, becoming very exclusive, and they're talking about certain identities which are not very open, but they are more very exclusive identities. And I mean, it sounds very simple what I'm going to say, but it also has to do with, when one such thing triggers, one such thing happens, or one major nation or one major area where these kind of narratives start taking shape, it is going to set off a chain of reactions where everything else will also be, because how else everybody will be like, I was telling you, fear is also an aspect. Because something is happening here, it will also set off fear mechanisms elsewhere where people will start looking inward rather than outward. So it's bound to happen, but like I said, that it requires another long lecture on that, but I'm sure I'll be happy to discuss this further with you later.
And just a follow-up, if you're
Yeah.
able to answer it now, but what kind of fears do you think movie appealed to in order to get to the place that where he is today?
So see, India is a large nation, but it also is a nation of youth. It's got one of the largest percentages of young people in the world. And one of the problems with that is that there's a lot of skilled, of course there is unskilled labor too, but there's a lot of skilled people who do not have jobs, or all these aspirational dreams that they had, that they can have their own house by a certain age, they can live a luxurious life. Like 20 years ago, they were brought up in that idea. 20 years ago, Indian economy was supposed to be booming, and in 20 years' time, we were supposed to become a developed nation. That's what this youth was told. That did not happen. We are still stuck where we were some 20 years ago. But so they grew up in that idea, and they also were brought up in the idea that the government at that time was to blame for it. Whereas it's not true. All the things that have happened, it's a very different economic history that one needs to delve into. But this particular youth, and especially this youth, is not only in complete urban situations, they're also in semi-urban situations. Most of them are in their 30s, 40s, some even in their 50s who are there. They support the government the most because they believe that this is their only way of having a lifestyle that they want and the kind of dream that they have. And that can only happen when certain groups are selected, because it's a huge population. We have a lot of people coming in and going out as well. So very recently, the Indian government also formalized a new Citizenship Amendment Act as well. Only certain people can now come into the country, only certain people can become citizens of the country. And this group between 30 to 50, largely support this. Because it means that the lesser that others have, they believe that more they will get.
Which is a pattern across the world also.
Yeah. And it's like they're probably very foolish because they don't think through, but then that's how it is.
To put things in perspective, like the biggest state in India in terms of population, Uttar Pradesh, has the population of Brazil.
Yes, we just checked it a couple of days back, yeah.
It has the population of Brazil, just to put things in. So, like the biggest single country in Latin America. Not only one big country, it's the single biggest country in Latin America. So, issues of scale are
Yeah, I mean,
complexity. Hence, we don't know much about the political system in India, because it's a federal system. You have state politics that vary, coming with even like divergence that could be traced back to the history. If we read about the history of the Communist Party in India, for instance, in states like Kerala or Bengal.
yeah, I mean, it's communist completely, like since the beginning of Indian independence movement, actually from 1920s onwards, when Communist Party became a big thing. The states of West Bengal and the state of Kerala has been Communist Party. But to just give you another example of the population density, I come from the city of Bangalore. Bangalore became a major city only after 1991 onwards. Like, the Indian government economic policies, privatization became a thing. So these cities boomed and so on and so forth. So the population of Bangalore is more than the population of South Korea, to just give you an example. So it's that big a group of people that we are talking about, and way too many complications. And literacy rates are not that high in every state. So they don't get to, like, they can hear things and understand, but not everybody gets to read everything. Literacy rates are almost over 90% in certain states and less than 20 in certain states. So it's that much of a difference as well. Yeah.
Much of what you are saying is
Very similar.
resonates. It is very similar. Agreed. But when we had again democracy for like half an hour, yeah, we came across these. I remember like the statistics of like different places with identity politics that were very similar. Right?
Yeah.
Like on an abstract level, they were the
Yeah,
same dynamics.
got it.
So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you for those very interesting questions.
But we had it during assembly, so we have this like 1 to 2 p.m.